We're delighted to be partnering with the Cuba Study Group on today's panel. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our partners at the Cuba Study Group. We want to especially thank our shared board member, Maria Garcia-Berry, who has a few words for us before we get started.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the America's Leadership Forum. I am so privileged to be introducing the next panel to you, which is on US-Cuba Re-Engagement. I am Maria Garcia-Berry. I am a board member of both the Biennial of the Americas and the Cuba Study Group. I think what's so significant about bringing these two organizations together, to work together, to have dialogue about the current situation in Cuba and in the United States toward Cuba, is both organizations have a big mission, which is a big mission of creating dialogue, fostering relationships for the Biennial all throughout Latin America. And the Cuba Study Group, one of its cornerstones is to encourage and initiate dialogue over very difficult issues, particularly through the Cuban communities throughout the world, but also primarily in the United States, to get to talk about difficult issues. I think this panel will be very enlightening. You'll learn a lot about what is happening today in Cuba, and also what the approach is, and the new approach under the new presidency of President Biden will be to Cuba. So again, I welcome you to this panel, and I hope you walk away with a lot of new thoughts and thought-provoking ideas. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Maria. We appreciate you more than you know. I want to thank Ricardo Herrera, the Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group, who's also sitting on our panel, and our moderator, Michael Bustamante, who will take it away. And thank you all for joining us.
I think that's my cue. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you. My name is Mike Bustamante. I teach Latin American history at Florida International University in Miami. It's nice to be out of Miami. There's heat here in Denver, but no humidity, so I consider that an improvement. Before I introduce our three esteemed panelists, I wanted to just take a couple minutes to sort of set the stage for the conversation, this conversation about US-Cuba re-engagement prospects in the Biden era. Many of us, I think, will remember the excitement, the hubbub, the hype, and also the criticism that accompanied the Obama administration's decision to begin normalizing ties with Cuba in 2014, in late 2014. For many, although certainly not for all, that policy change augured a moment of hope as US travelers, increased numbers of US travelers began supporting the growth of the private sector on the island, and to an important degree, I would argue, the prospects of undoing or de-escalating the contours of bilateral conflict raised hope that Cubans themselves would be able to define and debate the future of their country more on their own terms. But if you've been paying attention to the news over the last few years, you will also know that the Trump administration proceeded to dramatically reverse course against expectations and hope that the Obama administration's policy of engagement had sort of definitively turned the page on 5+ decades of a US policy of confrontation. The previous administration moved steadily, especially in 2019 and 2020, to undo almost every measure regarding contact, travel, and even government-to-government dialogue that the Obama policy had put in place. Which brings us to today. At the start of 2021, bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States, I would argue, were at their lowest point in years. Cuba, at the same time, finds itself in the midst of its worst economic crisis in 30 years. Which certainly has been aggravated by COVID, but is not reducible to that either. At the very moment that you would expect, because of that crisis, that Cuban officials would be their most conciliatory to try to set the stage for a possible re-engagement with the United States. In fact, over the last 6 to 8 months, we've witnessed really a rising wave of confrontation, hostility, and repression toward Cuban civil society activists. That certainly from an optical perspective, if nothing else, makes this a challenging moment to think about a policy of US-Cuba re-engagement. So to talk about all of these matters and to explore the three vertices of the Cuban triangle, Havana, Washington, and Miami, because how these issues play out in Miami also has bearing on the calculus that Washington makes, we're joined by three experts, and I'm lucky to say close friends. You have their full bios in the event materials, so I'm going to just introduce them briefly. First, we're really pleased to be joined by Lilian Guerra, professor of of Cuban and Caribbean history at the University of Florida, one of my mentors and a close friend. She's the author of many publications, but most recently of a book called Heroes, Martyrs, and Political Messiahs in Revolutionary Cuba, 1946 to 1958, which was published in 2018. So Lily, it's good to be with you, albeit virtually. Next, we'll hear from Gennady Rodriguez. Gennady was born in Cuba, raised in Cuba, studied law at the University of Havana, came to the United States in 2013, I believe, and today he's the editor of a really interesting media site called 23 and Flagler, which references the principal avenue in Havana on the one hand and another principal avenue in Miami. It's a really interesting and novel space for discussing what's happening in Cuba, the future of US-Cuban relations, and all kinds of matters from a variety of political perspectives. So looking forward to hearing from Gennady. And finally, we're joined by my friend Rick Herrero, who's the executive director of the Cuba Study Group, as you already heard. And the Cuba Study Group released a report earlier this year entitled US-Cuba Relations in the Biden Era, A Case for Making Engagement Resilient as a Means of Providing Long-Term Support for the Cuban People. So we have about an hour, a little less. In Cuban time, that's no time at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of ask a leading question to each of our panelists, ask them to respond in about 5 to 7 minutes. I'll then probably have a couple of questions that I'll throw at the entire panel. We'll have a little bit of discussion. And then at the end, in the last 15 minutes or so, we'll open it up to questions from both the audience that's present here and the one that's watching us online. So I want to turn to Lily first, if I can, and I'm going to look at the screen where I can see her face. Lily, as I noted, Cuba's in the midst of its worst economic crisis in 30 years. There is a new administration in Washington, and yet, as you have written recently in the New York Times, we're really, in some respects, in uncharted territory. Well, not perhaps uncharted territory, but very, very troubling territory vis-a-vis the state's relationship with Cuban civil society. So can you give us some context as to what's been happening in Cuba over the last 6 to 8 months and how that sort of fits into the broader political and economic backdrop of the state of affairs in the country currently?
Sure. What we have today is very much what we've had since 1991, and that's a battle between a state that has formally adopted capitalism and allowed for a small number of folks, more or less 10 to 15% of Cubans, to engage in self-employment. The battle between the government's desire to control that entrepreneurial sector, as well as allow it to a certain degree to flourish, because it cannot provide sufficient employment. It has not been able to provide 100% employment or even close to that since 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's another part to that story, which is very important since 2018 in particular, and that is that in 1991, there were a series of reforms that didn't just provide for self-employment, but allowed artists, musicians, and intellectuals to sell their work, to create work, and to sell their work independently of the state. And so the combination of the state's reliance on foreign investment, on tourism, and then entrepreneurs, and this additional ability of artists and intellectuals for the first time since really 1961 to express criticism and to sell it effectively in the form of movies and in the form of art and in music, criticism of everything, but especially criticism of the state, criticism of their own experiences. That really was a very testy part of this reality, this new reality post-1991. And then since 2018, we have seen, as you noted, a really radical increase in the degree and nature and expansion of repression, not just of artists and intellectuals, which has happened very deliberately and in a very orchestrated fashion. In August of 2018, the Cuban government effectively reversed all of the reforms that had passed with regard to that sector and passed this Decree 349, which requires that all artistic production, creative production, be vetted by the state and mediated by agencies of the state before it can be sold. So that means content can be evaluated in addition to the transmission or the sale being regulated by the state. So that happened, and that was a very obvious spark to what became a movement, effectively. In November of 2020, it acquired a name, 27th of November being a very particularly important historical date in the calendar of Cuban protest movement since the 19th century. But then in this past year, 2020, it became a moment in which you had about 300 artists protesting in front of the Ministry of Culture. And because all forms of public protest in Cuba are illegal, and they have been illegal since before 1961, really since 1960. This was not just unprecedented, it was stunning, and the Cuban state didn't quite know how to respond. That was also coupled with I would call it a generalized increase in the overt everyday repression of citizens that really peaked because of COVID and as a part of COVID. So just in terms of managing COVID, but also using COVID as an excuse to put Havana on lockdown, to ensure that people who were more discontent perhaps than ever before in terms of their economic situation and the political constraints on their economic capacity to fend for themselves, this was the chance that the government took. So what we have, today is a situation that is very much, in some ways, different than the 1960s through the 1980s, and in some ways identical. So to be very clear, from 1961 to 1991, communism as a system maintained itself by eliminating and controlling civil society. So you didn't have the right to form a union independent of the government. You didn't have the right to create a chess club independent of the government. Every social aspect of one's identity was somehow connected to a government agency. And the press especially was controlled by the government directly. So that scenario, in some ways, collapsed. In some ways, it remained there after 1991 because the Cuban government has never stated that it had endured a political crisis of any means with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the political values of the state from 1991 to 2021 have remained. What has changed is that the capacity of the state in the 90s through the early 2000s to really enforce those political values, and those values are authoritarian and require loyalty to the state above all, and demonstrations, public demonstrations of that loyalty. The capacity of the state really to police those values, to reinforce them, and to make sure that loyalty was a formal part of the public production of citizenship, that has really come roaring back under Raul Castro and now under Díaz-Canel. So I think that is something that we can say is significant, and it's a significant characteristic of daily life, not just, writ large. The other thing that is very important to mention, and with this note and one more I will close, but the other thing that's very important to mention is that throughout the last 60-some years, the Cuban government has always relied on the U.S. embargo in order to justify repression of human rights and to justify political discrimination, which was not just legal, but it was promoted and it was enforced when the government had, under sort of high communism and Soviet subsidies, when it had the power to enforce those things. So you didn't get promoted in school unless your political evaluation lined up with government demands, and political evaluations came first always. Since the 90s, the government has virtually been incapable of ensuring these kinds of political evaluations being the primary conduit for people's success in the system. But after Raul took power, that began to change, and it began to revert back to what we had in the 70s and 80s. So the recent arrests and detentions of rap musicians, the fact that artists like Tania Bruguera currently, twice a week has to endure rapid response brigades surveilling her, the fact that members of an artistic movement, which is also a protest movement based in Old Havana, known as the San Isidro movement, the fact that virtually all of their members are now under house arrest, those facts really reveal the degree to which the state is committed to retaining control over the public discourse and over citizens' ability to express freely what they want and how they want it and when they want it. So there is much more to say, but I think that that those things really matter. And I think the economic situation today is as dire or more dire than it was even in the early 90s. I mean, right now, the Cuban government's only source of income is really professional contracts abroad. So it's doctors abroad that are sending money through the government, or they're getting paid through these contracts. The Cuban government is receiving that money. That's the primary source of income for the Cuban national state. And locally, Cuban citizens have been trapped in their houses, and when they're not trapped in their houses, they've been standing in lines. So ration lines are also a means of controlling people's ability, to do anything in Cuba, and so line upon line, one after the other, often rendering very little result. By the time you get to the front of the line, there's really nothing left to buy. These kinds of anxieties and everyday forms of repression have had a really significant impact on morale in Cuba. So now, the artist protests have acquired, for both the average citizen, I think, for the artists and for the Cuban state, greater firepower than they would have in another moment.
Thanks so much, Lily. Lots to chew on, and I'm sure we could spend all day talking about those dynamics. I would just note quickly, I think one of the other elements that is perhaps new here is the power and access that more and more Cubans do have to social media. So Cubans have had access to the internet and their cell phones since 2018. So I think it goes to your point as to why some of these actions have perhaps had more impact than they would have had in another era. So Gennady, I want to turn to you, because obviously folks in Miami follow all things happening in Cuba very closely. That has always been the case, but perhaps never more so now than it is easier than ever, because of social media and WhatsApp and what have you, to be constantly in touch with what's happening on the ground and vice versa. So certainly some of the developments that Lily was referencing, both the difficulty of the economic situation, again, in part because of COVID, in part because of slowness of government reforms, and also this rising conflict between civil society and state, have been followed closely in Miami. And they have kind of fed into an ongoing debate that has always existed in Miami about how the U.S. should respond. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of the trend lines have been in Cuban American points of view on what the U.S. policy should be toward Cuba, in light of shared goals to promote a Cuban society that's more open and free?
Sure. Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon to all. Well, something very fascinating is happening in the Cuban American community in Miami. I'm going to get to that part of the story. But first, I want to briefly explain what we have been seeing in the polls. There has been an increased support for engagement with Cuba. I mean, that's something that is a pattern. However, it depends on who's going to be in the White House, let's see how big that support is going to be. For example, when Bush was in power, there was high support for the kind of isolation policies that the Bush administration had towards Cuba. But when Obama came, this completely changed. And then there was high support and majority support for what Obama was doing. And then we have Trump. And then we have, once again, a majority support for what the White House was doing. I believe you can see a pattern here. All Cuban Americans can have their own mind about what's going on in Cuba, but also what's going on in Washington influences a big deal what people in the Cuban American community are perceiving on what should the U.S. policy towards Cuba be. And Trump, for the last 4 years, he sold this idea of complete isolation. He was very consistent. And that, of course, I think had the result that by the end of his administration, about 66% of Cuban Americans were supporting Trump policies. So how this came to be? I mean, how is this possible? If you go to the objectives of this policy, create democratization, a democratic regime in Cuba, it hasn't worked. So why are we coming back to these ideas once and again? Now, what's fascinating now in Miami, and it's something that I had to learn involving with people, I never thought that I was going to be what's called an influencer. I think that is called it now. I used to teach at the School of Law of University of Havana. I was doing business consulting. But during the presidential campaign, I had to come forward, give my point of view, and try to create a platform to have more diverse opinions within the Cuban American community. Because honestly, those who were in favor of isolation policies, they were investing heavily on social media and on these online YouTube communities that also has been very effective to create, and to influence public opinion within the Cuban American community. Now, we all know Trump lost. We have Biden now. The expectation based on what Biden said is that he was half a move towards a more Obama-like policies. And that gave a moment for people who, even during the Trump administration, were trying to promote a change of policy towards Cuba. This was very underground. They started doing caravans, so they were taking the streets in bicycle. And the first caravan were about 8 people or 12 people, something about that. But the last one, and this was the last weekend, there were hundreds of people in Miami asking for lifting the embargo on Cuba. So that means that many people who thought that in Miami you will face repercussions because you were having a different opinion on what the policy should be towards Cuba are now more emboldened, are now showing themselves on the street. They're going to have another caravan this weekend. And now many of the major players in the online community defending the isolation policy towards Cuba, they're seeing themselves in the need to organize counter-protests to that. So there is a visible struggle within the community on what is going on. So I have a YouTube channel. And the first advice that I was given by someone who was doing it before me, he said, look, forget about discussing if you're gonna bring capitalism to Cuba or communism or whatever. I think people doesn't care about that anymore. Keep that in mind. I say, how is that possible? We want a democratic Cuba, we want the economic to thrive, we want people to have rights. And he said, forget about that. The main polarizing issue right now within the Cuban American community is the embargo and the isolation policy or not. Forget about that. You're going to find a lot of people who are very convinced capitalistic people. They want democracy in Cuba, but they believe that keeping the embargo is the worst thing we can do to promote that. And there is these other people who they believe that the embargo and the isolation policy will eventually bring this social uprising to change things. And I started to pay attention. I started to get the feedback from people coming to my channel, from creating my own online community, from participating in other people's online community. And I was convinced that yes, that is a fact. So right now, that is the main issue where Cuban Americans within Miami are having their discussion. It's happening in this underground, I would say underground, because you have to go to those YouTube channels, see thousands of people participating, organizing, mobilizing to do the caravans, the march. And it's fascinating because I think it shows how diverse the opinion towards this US policy towards Cuba has. I personally believe that if we look at that other pattern that I mentioned before, if now the White House indeed do not rely only on recent polls that comes exactly from the communications policy from the Trump administration, but if they do what Obama did, or at least if not exactly as Obama, they tend towards engagement with Cuba somehow, at least on humanitarian reasons, I think that's going to give a huge boost to those people who are against the embargo. And something very interesting and fascinating that I'm having, I really criticize the Cuban government and the Cuban system. I say it's a totalitarian system. I say it's autocratic. I mean, I use the word synonymous, and still keep having people from Cuba coming to my platform and openly supporting it. because the main issue is not my critics toward the system, it's the embargo. And they believe that what they should be supporting is the lifting of the embargo no matter what. So that's very interesting. And I was showing Rick the other day a post that I did on my platform that the first 2 likes from users that it received is from an artist in Cuba who has come forward and said he's a communist, and a prisoner from the Primavera Negra. So this is an ex-political prisoner in Cuba. So those polls were liking and engaging on the same message. So that's something very, I think, fascinating and important. And I think that's what's happening. And I presume we have to see what the Biden administration does. But I think that's the pattern. You can, have an idea of what's going on there.
Thanks, Gennady. I mean, it's so interesting because I think I think over recent years too, you're also responding in social media to the rise of new voices on social media that were full in on the Trump policy. And what was unique about those voices is that they were representative more of a more recent cohort of Cuban migrants to the United States that historically had been the ones that had been most defended a policy of engagement, right? So there's definitely tension happening in the Cuban American community around this issue. So I think Gennady and Lily too have set the table nicely to turn to Rick and to ask you to share, your impressions of, what the thinking is at this point, to the extent that we have evidence of it in the Biden administration as to how to move forward, given that no president wants to come into office and just say, I'm going to go back and do, Obama 2.0, right? He wants to put his own spin on things, given that Democrats didn't do well in South Florida, and that may make people skittish because, of course, US-Cuba policy is a matter of domestic politics, but also given the scale of the humanitarian and political crisis in Cuba right now. What is the Biden administration thinking? What did they promise? Where do you see it going?
Thank you, Mike. And first of all, thank you to the Biennial for hosting us today and for our audience for joining us. The scenario in Washington is no less complex right now. I mean, we have, after 4 years of Trump policy, we're left behind by design with a highly restrictive sanctions environment towards travel, towards trade, remittances, and even proactive diplomatic engagement between the United States and Cuba. Biden wins the election, in part having pledged to do a partial rollback of the Trump policy insofar as travel, remittances, and consular services are concerned, so reinstating full travel, access to remittances, or the flow of remittances from the United States to Cuba, as well as reopening the consular services that were shut down at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. But he comes in, and these are all measures, not just those measures, but also all the other, the full reversal or near absolute reversal of Obama policy that we saw under Trump. All of that was done through executive order, and all of this would be fairly easy to undo if there were the political will to do it. But Biden comes into a very tricky political environment as he enters the White House. First, as you mentioned, the elections in South Florida. Biden won the national election, lost Florida, and won a lesser percentage of the Cuban American vote than either of his Democratic predecessors, Hillary and Obama. So he came in at a very low approval rating among Cuban Americans. Second, he comes in with a Senate that split 50-50, one that Democrats within the Senate, along with the White House, are trying to push forth a very aggressive legislative agenda in which they need every single vote in order to make things happen. Every single vote on their side of the aisle in order to get things done. And one of those more consequential votes is also happens to be the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who is Senator Robert Menendez from New Jersey, who has positioned himself as the most vocal voice on Cuba policy in the U.S. Senate, and who we know does not favor a policy of engagement, is much more in favor of a policy of isolation. So the administration has been, even though they made these promises during the campaign, they've been sending mixed signals insofar as the timeline and scope for any sort of policy change. They've frequently mentioned that there is a policy review going on, one that's going to be governed by two principles, which they've stated time and again. First, support for democracy and human rights, that's going to be at the core of their efforts. And then second, that Americans, and especially Cuban Americans, are the best ambassadors for freedom to Cuba. And that, again, it's a very thorough review, that they are committed to fulfilling these campaign promises, but then they caveat by saying, but Cuba's not a priority. And it's been over 150 days so far since Biden came into office, and there has been no real movement on Cuba policy. To our knowledge, the reviews that are taking place are not interagency in nature. It's not for sort of a wide-ranging change in policy yet. What they are, it's much more piecemeal between different executive agencies. So we have, I think the one most often cited is the one that the State Department is leading. And that involves right now a series of, they're having stakeholder sessions and meetings with all sorts of folks that who are impacted by US policy towards Cuba. And this includes elements such as also the enforcement of Title III, Cuba's listing in the state sponsors of terror list, which happened in the final days of the Trump administration. You also have a Pentagon-led review on the use of the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay as a international terrorist prison. You know, its status since the Bush administration. They're taking a look to see if they can change that in this administration. And there's a CIA-led review investigation into what's known as the Havana syndrome, which are the series of mysterious health incidents that were suffered by U.S. diplomatic and intelligence personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, starting in late 2016. But that we have since learned these incidents have sort of gone global in scale, and there is no clear sign of who is behind them. There's a lot of speculation that it's most likely the Russians, but there is no smoking gun, if you will. These reviews continue, but we don't know if there's going to be any. We don't know how much further they're looking at a deeper, a more substantive shift in policy. We see real echoes here of a Clinton administration in which, even though many within Biden's inner circle are pro-engagement and supported the Obama policy, they've shown little inclination to take this issue on because it's politically hazardous and has very little clear upside for the administration. And so they're laser focused on their agenda, on what's popular with American voters. And right now, as has been mentioned, Cuba and re-engaging with Cuba is nowhere near as popular as it was during the Obama opening. So sort of the practical result of all this right now is that Trump policy remains on autopilot. For now, any regulation that's subject to executive orders that were put in place under the Trump administration that are currently under review by the Biden administration, the Trump executive orders will continue to govern until that review is complete. And we've seen that already sort of manifest itself in many ways. We saw it yesterday with the vote at the UN in which the United States voted against condemning the embargo. So running counter to the last vote under the Obama administration that they voted to abstain. Again, since we're not going to see any changes until they finish this review, the Trump policy remains, and they very much voted against condemning the embargo. We saw it in the annual human rights report where it had very strong rhetoric that very much echoed the kind of rhetoric that we saw under the Trump administration, and also the recent redetermination that Cuba has not been fully cooperating in counterterrorist efforts. There's a real risk in all this, in the Biden administration's inattention towards Cuba, that it will cause irreparable damage in the bilateral relationship and further exacerbate conditions on Cuba that have led to the status quo. And it seems, based on a lot of the sort of the actions and views expressed by Cuban officials, that they may be misinterpreting this deprioritization or hands-off approach in the meantime, while this administration focuses on much more urgent matters in their agenda, that they may be interpreting this as a purposeful embrace of Trump policy when it's in no way clear that that's the case. But of course, if state repression continues, as been cited by Lillian and others in this panel, this could all become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because part of what makes the politics of this is so tricky is conditions on the island. The worse that Cuban Americans see the Cuban government behave, the less support you see towards engagement or any loosening of policy towards Cuba. Having said all this, we do expect the Biden administration to move on it's already on the policy changes that it did pledge during the campaign, reopening travel, remittances, and consular services. It's something that can happen as soon as the summer, perhaps a little bit later. But there is a growing concern that this humanitarian crisis that we're seeing in Cuba could bubble over and become a migratory crisis across the Florida states. And that's something that this administration, or frankly no one, should want.
Yeah. Thanks, Rick. Yeah, and we've seen numbers ticking up of Cubans coming on rafts and things like that, notwithstanding changes in immigration policy that date to the Obama administration that mean that Cubans don't have sort of the fairly open path to legal residency as was the case in the past. So I want to throw a question at all the panelists, and it has to do with, in a way, a certain paradox that I see with regard to political and economic developments on the island now. And I want to ask each of you to reflect on it, or how you see it, and again, what bearing it might have on what the Biden administration might do. On the one hand, we heard from Lillian in detail, and there's more detail to be shared about this conflict between civil society and state, particularly in recent months. But I think the other thing that's interesting about this moment is that in July 2020, in the height of the pandemic, the pandemic seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back, potentially in some ways, to getting the Cuban government to kind of re-up the ante on economic reform plans that had been, gone through sort of ups and downs since 2010. They've now committed to, a pretty significant expansion of what the Cuban state calls self-employment. They've committed to not just self-employment, but allowing, in fact, small businesses that exist in Cuba to, in effect, incorporate and gain legal personality as small and medium-sized enterprises, which would mean you could run a business not out of your own personal bank account, which would be a good thing. And they've also moved forward, this of the three measures, this is the only one they've actually moved forward on. In January 2021, they began a very difficult, many would argue necessary, but nonetheless painful process of currency unification and, in effect, devaluation that in the short term has hit people's pockets really hard in the absence of some of these other economic measures that would allow the economy to respond. But there does seem to be a signal that's being sent that on the economic reform front, there will be forward motion, right? At the same time that there is this very tense, conflicted dynamic between state and civil society. So in any of your estimation, I mean, what's the signal, if any, that the Cuban authorities are sending to the Biden administration? Can a certain follow-through on the economic reform front provide an opportunity for the Biden administration to move and to try to bolster those efforts if we think they're good? And at the same time, does the continued intensification of conflict between civil society and state, would that negate that possibility? So maybe I'll turn to Lily first. We'll go in the order that we started.
Well, I personally don't think that any of the measures that you're talking about there, the Cuban government has any intention of relying on to expand the power of entrepreneurial sectors in Cuba. They are intended to come out now so that they can make the case to the citizenry that they have attempted to expand their opportunities, but in a context in which there's absolutely no access to resources like the funding from abroad, even if it's only $100 a month you might get from your cousin, in Gainesville. That's often enough to make things work for you if you have a tiny little business stripping off the husk of rice, kernels for your local peasants. Without the $100 is not happening, and the way in which the Cuban government is addressing the banking issues is sort of, as you said, it's enough to be discussed in a larger, much longer format. But it has always been the case that when you want to withdraw money from your bank account in Cuba, you have to actually tell the teller what you're using it for. So most Cubans don't put their money in bank accounts. They have absolutely no trust in the Cuban state. And that includes the entrepreneurial class. On the other hand, 82% of the economy is in the hands of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, the armed forces, which has replaced, in fact, the Communist Party as the main operator in the economy. That's one of the differences between the 70s and the 80s and the current situation. In every store and in every discotheque that's owned and operated by the Cuban government, the director of that, the dirigente or the gerente, the manager of it, is no longer just a party member. Most of the time, they're not even a party member. They're a Ministry of the Interior intelligence agent. So this is something that has been happening since 2009, and it is generalizable today. You could go to a discotheque in Holguín and discover that the gerente is a Ministry of the Interior intelligence official. So what you have is a percentage of this superstructure of the government, which is utterly committed to containing and controlling the revenues from state capitalism. And the only way to do that is to contain and constrain those below them. They surely have bank accounts. Many of them are not even in Cuba. Most of them probably don't have bank accounts in Cuba. They have them in Panama, or they have them in Spain, or they have them in Switzerland. So these are the CEOs, GESA, which is the big corporation that really is the conglomerate that, as I say, controls 82% of the economy in Cuba and brings in the revenue. They have been the past and the future for the last 5 years. And I do think that we're making a mistake if we're somehow thinking that the civilians in this administration in Cuba are actually in power. The more important parts of the government there are the ones with the weapons and the ones with the money, and the ones that have control over foreign investment transactions. And all of those guys are in the Ministry of the Armed Forces and the Ministry of the Interior. So, what signals are they sending to the Biden administration? Zero. They want to contain and constrain, and they're delighted to have this embargo in place. I mean, when the things that happened in May and June exploded in terms of the repression of artists, exploded in the international media for the first time, people were paying attention. The New York Times published this op-ed. The Washington Post went after it. And you had all of this sort of what is in Cuba illegal media like El Toque, publishing about regularly. And you had Facebook live streaming of people talking about showing the repression on the streets in Cuba, not just artists, but just random citizens. When all that was happening, what did the Cuban government say? It said what it's always said, that the only human rights violations in Cuba are those committed by the U.S. embargo. So if there's going to be any shift, it really, I do believe, would have to happen here with the United States saying an end to the embargo. That would throw all the cards in the air. And it's unfortunate the Obama administration didn't go that far, because with the little that they did do, which was quite a bit, I mean, it's pretty dramatic when it happened, the Cuban government had no response, really. They didn't know what to do. They didn't, other than to immediately freak out and try to diminish and discredit Obama and represent him personally in kind of racist terms. Other than that, I mean, they couldn't even come up with a better slogan for his visit in March of 2016 than "Welcome to Cuba." I mean, I really do think we got to talk about what we can do in this country, and that's the most dramatic thing we could do. And frankly, the people on the far right who want to say that the embargo is somehow, a moral stance, give me a break. You are actually giving the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias and the Ministry of the Interior all the weapons that they need to continue to do what they've been doing for the last 60 years, but particularly for the last 10. And the opportunity lost in the 90s by the Clinton administration will be repeated again by the Biden administration unless they do something. And they take a stand, and a stand that is going to be controversial in some sectors. But the reality is that most of the people in Miami would love to see radical change and want to go and change their island. And those are the people who do travel to Cuba. The folks who maybe have the microphones and the ear of and Senator Rubio, none of those people go to Cuba. They haven't been to Cuba, for decades, or they've never been there. So, this is my reaction to that question.
Just because we're a little bit short on time and I want to make sure it's time for questions.
Sure.
What's your impression of the economic reform discussion? What relevance does it have? Is it significant? Is it not? Your reaction to the question. And
yeah, no, I agree
with
many of what Lillian said. I think that the main problem is the embargo, and I used to say that, look, with the embargo in place, you don't expose the responsible for what's going on completely. And it has shown that it's unable to take them out of power. So if you don't show who the responsible is and you can take them out of power, what are you looking for? And of course, because of the embargo and this protest with San Isidro movement, I see, because I talk with many people all the time, I don't have any reason to think that everyone that interacts with my platform is paid by the Cuban government. So I have to presume a huge part of people who are very smart, very well educated, they're just sharing with me their real thoughts. And they're telling me, look, I don't want to follow San Isidro because they want a social uprising. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's the cost. I'm going to pay myself. So I do not want to follow what they're doing. They do have a huge support here in the Cuban American community in Miami, but that's not going to change dynamics within the island. And the reason many of those people are not following, and sometimes even ignoring the legitimate right of these San Isidro activists to protest, is because they said, hey, there is an embargo in place, there is a regime change policy, they want to create social chaos, I don't know what's the price I'm gonna have to pay, so I'm not following their lead. I'm just trying to have some economic reform, and I do believe that if the US will accompany and help those reforms, I'd be better myself.
Yeah. Rick, and just to add one other element here, I mean, of course, the challenge with the idea of what the U.S. needs to do is lift the embargo is that the White House has its hands tied to a certain degree because of congressional law in the codification of the embargo. So your impressions on the impact of economic reform vis-a-vis the political question in Cuba and how that might shape the Biden administration's response?
So the Cuban government's sending mixed signals. On the one hand, they keep saying that they are undergoing this very transformative economic, they call it the new economic strategy, but it's a transformation of its economy in which they are going to allow for the private sector to play a greater role in the most productive areas of the economy. They're going to finally legalize and have even authorized the creation of small and medium-sized enterprises for the first time in 60 years, in over 60 years in Cuba. But it's not reflected in law yet. They are going to expand the private sector and have already signaled in which ways they're going to expand that private sector. But the final list of private sector activities or the activities that will be prohibited hasn't been published yet. So they've been signaling that these things are coming and that they're coming soon, but they don't go into effect. You can see that there are inherent tensions. One thing we always got to keep in mind when it comes to the Cuban government, especially post-Fidel, it is not a monolith. There are factions within that government. There are more orthodox factions, there are more reformist factions, and you see the tensions within those factions in a lot of their policymaking because it looks like a mishmash of things, and a lot of it's ineffective and gets dragged out for years in many cases. At the same time, this wave of repression against artists, journalists, the San Isidro movement works against a renewal of relations because it makes it less politically salient here in the United States, right? Because again, people respond strongly when they see artists getting beat up inside their homes. And the challenge here when it comes to the embargo is that there is a great opportunity in what is the Cuban private sector. If Cuba would finally go ahead and legalize the private sector, legalize those small and medium-sized enterprises, and allow foreign investment into those businesses, allow private sector actors in the United States to partner up independently with private sector actors in Cuba and invest in their businesses, and treat Cubans in the diaspora and anyone in the diaspora that's interested in the Cuban market, allow them to have the same, rights as people on the ground, and most importantly for people on the ground. Nobody should be treated here as second-class citizens in this kind of scenario. But opening that up, what's so important about opening up the private sector, as far as the embargo is concerned, is that when the embargo was codified into law, it didn't foresee a private sector under the current government. So it would be the sector that's least exposed to codified sanctions under US law, and the one that has the most potential to not only build stronger ties between the United States and Cuba, strictly through the United States private sector and the private sector on the island, but also through those ties, generating the political momentum necessary to see more fundamental policy change in Washington.
Thanks, Rick. So we just have exactly 10 minutes left, so I think I'm on time. And so I want to open up the floor in person and also virtually for questions from the audience. I suppose I'll start by asking if there's questions here in the room, or I'll turn to the organizers here to share some of the questions that come from online, if anybody has a question. Please.
Thank you. I would like to just give an additional statement.
If I may, just because we're short on time, if you could please phrase your question in the form of a question.
Very
Forgive me.
Very brief. There's hope in the horizon for the lifting of the embargo, believe it or not. There are 5 issues that need to be done before Congress can look at the embargo and even consider to repeal it. The first one is that no Castro is in power, check. The second one is that there is a substantial private business enterprise in the island with about 500,000 private business in the island that would qualify. The third one is that there are independent press in the island. Now there's 7 independent press, so you can check that box too. That means there's 2 left. And one is the release of political prisoners, and the other one would be that they adopt a new, more Western-friendly system of government, even if it is a socialistic system, but more like what you would see, say, in Europe or in Canada. And that's the big holdup. And that's something that hopefully in time they can be convinced that what would help them, what would help the Cuban people, what would help the Cuban Americans here in the island, what would help even the Americans to go back and do business with Cuba, what would also bring Cuba to the forefront of being in the market with the rest of the world, would be to adopt a new system, socialistic as an evolution of where they are now.
Thanks for the comment. I think I'll treat it as a comment rather than a question. I think do we have any questions from online? So let me turn the floor over to this side of the room.
Yeah. It seems to me that we have not done enough thinking and enough academic work and enough understanding on a role of the embargo that very few people talk about. We talk about the embargo as not having worked. We talk about embargo as possibly setting up a pressure cooker system that might result in chaos or a social explosion in Cuba. We have talked enough about the embargo harming innocent people in Cuba and all of that. But there needs to be a lot more thought given to the embargo acting or serving the role of an obstacle to change in Cuba. Rather than encouraging Cuba to change, the embargo actually, in my opinion, makes it very difficult for Cuba to change. The economic changes that Cuba needs to undertake become almost impossible to effect with the wide-ranging sections of the embargo. So I think it would be useful to have some additional work, some additional understanding on that aspect of the embargo, because in many ways it is a policy that, while intended to cause Cuba to change, may in fact be obstaculizing or delaying those changes very effectively. So I think this is where we need to provide additional thinking on this issue.
Thanks for the reflection. Just in the interest of time, why don't I throw it back to the panelists just for maybe a final comment in response to either that comment or other things that we've discussed. We have about 5 minutes, so just give everybody about a minute before we go ahead and close it out. So Lily, last words.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the Cuban Constitution of 2019 grants the party rule in perpetuity. And you could just look, Article 9, for instance, says that commitment to socialism, as defined by the current Cuban Communist Party, is obligatorio. So this is not a regime currently that is interested in changing its political structures at all. So if that's going to be a condition for eliminating the embargo, I mean, then we're just, we're talking to ourselves. I think that the need to change U.S. policy with regard to the embargo is very critical, because the little bits of holes in the embargo that we saw form in 2016 and that I personally witnessed were stunningly successful. So you had about 100,000 Americans visiting Cuba, bringing their information. You had all kinds of connectivity, both by social media and also just cultural and intellectual engagement, the creation of so many different and what are still illegal magazines and digital newspapers in Cuba, like El Estornudo is another one. This is not a free press. This is an independent press that is struggling to survive. So, but we got, for a very short period of time, just a dramatic shift in the attitudes of Cubans towards what was possible. And I think that needs to come back to Cuba, however it can. So even if just Biden turns to Obama's old policies and does those things, they drove enough holes into the embargo that the shift in people's understanding of what was possible and their willingness to take on the state and also to create change and dynamics of growth in the economy and at the ground level, they were very impressive. You could not deny them. And I hope that even if that's all we do, that will be enough to really to effect a transitional situation of some variety whose outcome is unpredictable. And I think the unpredictability of the outcome is something that we should not worry about, because it's not our country. It's Cubans' country.
Give an idea on what Carlos said. And it's something I always said in my channel is, look, with the embargo, the risk threshold is very high for them for changing, because anything they do, it can end up very bad. So if we can give them some space so they can, by trial and error, move forward with these changes, we can accompany them and help them and try to be there so we can, lower that threshold risk. I think we will be more successful in seeing significant change in Cuba than the other way around.
Thanks, Gennady. Rick, final word to you.
Real quick, we can all talk about lifting the embargo. It requires political capital to do so. The embargo is in the hands of Congress, and we would need them to move in order to repeal it, unless Cuba ends up meeting all the conditions under Helms-Burton. The more promising ways to create that momentum are right now, to the most part, in the hands of the Cuban side of the Cuban government. Speed up the expansion of the private sector and allowing U.S. investors to be able to partner up with entrepreneurs and invest in that sector to strengthen those ties, and also take proactive steps to improve relations with your diaspora. And a great part of that is improving relations with your own civil society, because that civil society has its relatives and friends in the diaspora. And Cuba has to understand that this battle that they continue to fight, that they continue to frame as a battle with the tyrant of the North, the United States, is really a conflict among Cubans. And until the relationship between Cuba and its diaspora changes, we're going to see this vicious cycle continue ad infinitum.
Thanks, Rick. I'll just end on one thought. That I think this has been a really great panel for beginning what can continue to be a reflection about, obviously U.S.-Cuban relations, but the importance of also not understanding Cuba only through the prism of its relationship with the United States. And yet we have to understand Cuba from the inside out. And we also can't deny the importance of the US-Cuba relationship either. And those dynamics are incredibly complex and rich and worthy of future exploration. So I want to thank the panelists, Lily, Gennady, Rick. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate your time, and I'll turn it back over to the MCs.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to our fantastic panelists. And we're deeply grateful to the Cuba Study Group for our partnership, and we look forward to hosting more conversations on this. Clearly, there's so much more to be discussed, and we're just grateful to those of you in the room and those of you who are tuning in online. Thank you all.